Recently, a game dropped by a studio called Critical Hit Games. That game was called Nobody Wants to Die. First off, thanks to Critical Hit for sending me a code for this game. It is an on-rails walking sim with crime scene investigation elements, with a fairly interesting concept in terms of story. The world the game is set in is a futuristic dystopian New York City during the 2300s, and it explores the concept of immortality and whether or not that would actually be a good thing. There's not too much else to say except for the fact that there will be spoilers in this video for Nobody Wants to Die. Let's begin. It's the year 2329. James Kara is sat in his car and is watching an old noir detective film from times gone by. He's speaking to a woman named Rachel who is obviously a romantic interest in James's life. But all of a sudden, James experiences something strange. He's seemingly having an attack of some sort. He takes some pills called ambrosia. Rachel then disappears, as do the effects from this attack that James has just experienced. He receives a call from his longtime friend and his boss, the police chief, Steiner. Basically, James is a police officer and works in the Department of Mortality. A strange name, but we'll get to that soon. 2 weeks prior, James and his partner Seth were involved in a case which resulted in both of their deaths, along with many innocents after a train crashed in the city. James was suspended. But why suspend him if he actually died? How do they survive? Well, James, through advancements in science and technology, was given a new body, but we'll discuss the details on that shortly. James tells the chief that he's ready to get back to work, but Steiner declines this, saying that James is still suspended and needs to rest, and that the higher-ups will not allow him to return so soon. After some pestering, Steiner reluctantly assigns James to an off-the-books case, which is a favour to someone very important. Steiner then puts James in touch with the officer who will be his liaison officer, Sarah Kai. She has read James's record and isn't too thrilled to be working with him, as he's known to be erratic, and she's aiming for the fast track to a big promotion. After some vicious words between them, James identifies the mail terminal and heads there to pick up a package containing important information about the case. Opening the package and receiving his badge back, to his and Sarah's surprise, the victim in question is Edward Green. Simply put, Green is dead as the result of an accident, and they need to go to his apartment and extract something from Green. Something that is referred to as Ichorite. Simple enough. After another attack and vision of Rachel, James heads to the apartment. Getting there, and with Sarah giving him access to the crime scene and staying in contact, James finds that Green had checked out from the journey that we call life. Checking out Green, James is unable to extract the Ichorite from Green's charred body as it's been completely destroyed. This is now a murder scene. Using his tech to reconstruct the murder scene, James discovers that there's more at play here, as it seems like Green was indeed murdered, but that the murderer had covered their tracks really well. It also seems that Green had been forced to sabotage the electrics and some flammable substance had exploded, and that is why the body had been burned. There is also a very strange symbol, along with the exact date of Green's death carved into the tree. Chief Steiner calls and tells James to do what he was asked, to report it as an accidental death and to leave. Carrying on, James discovers that there's more to this case. Green appeared to be drunk and tried to smash open the floor with his own forehead, but it could be the case that someone else did this to him. He also has what appears to be a wound on his back, meaning that he had been fighting with someone. He also appeared to be begging for mercy at one point. Crucially, James goes on to find a pocket watch, and inside a photo of Green, along with 2 friends. These 2 friends are men named John Park, owner of Demise Foods, and Dmitry Kovalev, a smuggler who owns a flying bar and club called the Icarus, a bar frequented only by the rich and powerful. Given that a gift from Green to one of these 2 men is on the floor of his home, James and Sarah surmise that one of these 2 must have done it. In addition, James finds a strange bottle with a snake on it and an odd liquid inside. He has another desynchro attack and sees more visions of Rachel. Leaving the crime scene, James heads back to his apartment. But a bit of background. The reason that James works in the New York Mortality Squad is due to immortality. You see, humanity had found a way to give human beings immortality through the Ichorite, but it's not a perfect technology. Not at all. Ichorite was discovered and developed by the Boyle family, but this discovery would bring a darkness, a bleakness, and a despair to the world. It goes as far back as 2042, when the US government realized that the world and nature were essentially dying, worse than they thought. they decided that they needed to save natural heritage. Nature parks would become living museums and refuges for endangered flora and fauna. Around 15 years later, in 2057, researchers had managed to develop a formula that could resurrect any plant. This was also the flammable formula that was on the tree in Green's apartment. But then, in 2071, environmental issues posed a threat in the form of acid rain. Despite efforts to reduce pollution, the rain ravaged the planet. Nature didn't stand a chance. Therefore, in places like Central Park, holographic versions of plants and trees were used instead. By 2088, the environmental collapse was now incredibly serious, and the US president promised to resurrect every single plant on Liberty Island. This is also when the Icarite technology was invented by the Boyle family. It does appear that the sun may have died too, as a poster shows that there's an island you can visit with a fully functional artificial sun, and this may explain why, in the city, you cannot really see the sky. Let's go back to 2025. Edward Green was a politician as early as 2025, and here he is with the then US president. In the year 2137, Congress signed the Declaration of Immortality. At some point in his life, it's unclear what year, Green had opted for Icarite implantation in order to become immortal. His wife, however, did not, and this led to her eventual, inevitable, natural and permanent death. Now Edward, who would never remarry, didn't like that his loved one was gone forever, so he changed the entire world forever using his position as the Secretary of Health, and he passed a law in which Icarite implantation was mandatory. Not only that, but humans no longer owned their own bodies after the age of 21. After that, people had to pay a subscription fee in order to keep their own body. This meant that people who couldn't pay essentially had their bodies repossessed, and their consciousness would be stored in a facility called the CTC, or the Consciousness Transfer Center. Government regulations and guidelines for maintaining the body were set out, such as a mandatory amount of steps and exercise needing to be carried out per day. It would be James's job to go and repossess the bodies that their owners could no longer pay for, or that were being neglected. Bodies were graded by their quality, A-class being the fittest, healthiest bodies in the best condition, all the way down to E-class being the bottom level, which were bodies formerly owned by drug addicts, so naturally these had some defects. James, for example, had an E-class shell replacement after the accident that had allergies. It was lactose intolerant, had bronchial asthma, scoliosis and hypertension, and the former owner was a drug addict. So James would experience drug withdrawals from time to time. Parties would be held by people called familiarization parties, which would celebrate someone getting their new body. Prices for B-class and C-class bodies were increased by 240% over 50 years, so you can only imagine how much A-class bodies were worth. Body auction ads would be played and plastered all over the city. But Edward, who by this point had changed his shell many times, was up to something dark. Due to some parents not being able to pay for their body subscriptions, their bodies were seized and their children were orphaned. Edward would open and fund an orphanage along with a man named Brian Theodore Coven, and they would essentially wait until these children were 21. Naturally, these 21-year-olds wouldn't be able to pay for their bodies, so their consciousness would be extracted, stored, and Edward Green and the other elites would have their pick of a new shell should they need it in the future. On the outside, Edward was a decent guy helping orphans, but what he was doing in the shadows was so much darker. James lives on the 537th floor on Liberty Avenue in Brooklyn. Getting settled, James is greeted by the AI, Hestia. Hestia being named after the Greek goddess Hestia, who is the virgin goddess of the hearth and the home. Inside the apartment, we get a bit of background on James. He is a former pro baseball player in the MLB. I say former, as an injury put a stop to James's career. He got a new shell and his old body went to be displayed in the MLB Hall of Fame. After he had difficulties adapting to his new shell, James was forced to retire and became a detective due to his love of noir crime thrillers. Anyway, James receives a call from Sarah. Through conversation with Sarah in regard to the case, she mentions James's wife, Rachel. It seems that Rachel self-deleted in the same way that Green did, although James can't accept that is how she went. Working together, they put the evidence on a makeshift investigation board and recall some interesting things. That someone was determined to destroy Green's Icarite, that Green was stabbed literally in the back, and that if there was a murderer, they left a pocket watch there. They find that Green had a meeting with two people on the day that he died, Jane Salma, a famous psychiatrist, and Dmitry Kovalev. Park, on the other hand, was caught speeding with a traffic camera snapping a photo of him with his arm around Jane Salma, so this excludes Salma and Park, as the photo was taken at the time of the murder, so it must be Kovalev. Green had traces of gunpowder on his hands, and an unidentified substance was found inside Green's system, meaning he could have been poisoned. James suspects a cover-up. With all the information in front of them, they decide that their prime suspect is Kovalev, as he's the only one who saw Green prior to his death, who currently has no alibi. James then comes clean and tells Sarah about the strange flask he found at the murder scene, the one with the snake on it. He sends it to Sarah and she says she'll test the contents and try to find out what it is. James then prepares the official report, ruling it a murder against the chief's demands. Sitting on the balcony, James is taking in the views and sees Kovalev's bar, the Icarus, flying overhead, likely full to the brim with the elites, drinking the finest whiskey. Sarah then calls James and tells him that the vial contains poison which is harmful to Icarite, which explains why Green's Icarite was destroyed. But a fingerprint that was on it points straight to Kovalev. All of a sudden, a rumbling occurs and the apartment shakes. The Icarus has crashed. Not wanting to miss this opportunity to get aboard and confront Kovalev, and with it close to falling down into the chasm below, James boards the Icarus. Finding his way to the bar area, it's a mess and bodies lie everywhere. Looking for Kovalev, James scours the bar area, and investigating, he finds the following. An explosion took place, which explains the explosion James saw from the balcony, and this explosion took out a few people, namely John Park, the other man in the photo with Green, Martin Roy, the owner of the New York Liberation Stadium, and Miller, an arms dealer and the owner of Phalanx Security, who had recently acquired a new unregistered body for $4 million. Unregistered because he does dodgy work for the government. Strangely, a scarf belonging to Jane Salma was there on the seat, but there's no sign of Salma herself. One of James's fellow agents was there, a man who James recognized from Rachel's case, an agent Nils Dean. He was meeting Travis Collette, who designed the tower building that Green lived in, and Dean had purchased the blueprints for said building, evidenced by a briefcase full of cash. This was before he was shot by someone in the bar area and impaled by debris. And a private security guard working for the Phalanx Corporation saw shots being fired and was killed. Through more investigation, James finds out that Park and Roy were looking at documents that proposed a plan to eventually lower the free body subscription age from 21 and down to 18, despite the US president giving assurances to the public that this would not happen. And there were plans to increase the cost of subscriptions by 15 to 20%. More money for the rich. Recalling a newspaper article, Roy was planning to hold a series of games at the stadium to distract the public from this news, and Miller was brought in to protect the rich should things kick off. Whoever blew up the bar had the ultimate aim of delaying these plans. James learned that the gunman who opened fire was Kovalev. Not only that, but Kovalev had sticks of dynamite strapped to him and blew himself up, so there were two explosions. The bar safe features another symbol, identical to the one on the tree in Green's apartment, with the date of the incident on it. The safe itself contains a key card and a note from Green speaking about a plan, that Green feels his breath on his neck. All this had been carefully thought out. Upon leaving, James hears someone talking to him. James thinks that this may be the murderer. He taunts James, telling him that he missed a body. This leads James to discover the dead body of George Boyle, the director of the CTC. It's quite clear from where Kovalev activated his vest and where Boyle was, that Boyle was the intended target. Putting him out of commission would mean years of disruption for the planned body subscription changes. The stranger talking to James gives him a choice. He says that Boyle will only end up having his Icarite pulled out and placed into a new shell, and all this will just continue. He urges James to shoot Boyle in the head, destroying his Icarite and desynchronizing him. James can also just leave him there on the Icarus. Whatever James chooses, the Icarus starts to fall into the abyss, but James manages to make it to a vehicle and escape. A conversation with the chief about what he'd found doesn't really go in James's favour, as the chief doesn't want to know and he pulls James off the case. James lies on the hood of his car and ponders the case and what it all means. Is the chief being bribed? Is there an undercover operation happening? Who is the stranger? Is he the murderer? And what was Green and Kovalev's plan? James speaks with Sarah, has a drink and suffers another desynchro attack. He's confronted by two officers who ask him what he's doing. They attempt to tow his car, but James can either fake a desynchro attack or Sarah can help him out, and the police then leave. James then heads back to his apartment again. On the balcony, he sees that everything is kicking off in the city. Illegal gatherings and protests are taking place over body subscriptions, and the president's recent announcement that the age limit has now been reduced to age 20. The people want their bodies back, and the police are trying to disperse the crowds. Hestia tells James that he's scheduled for his synchronization test. Suffering more effects of desynchronization and seeing visions of Rachel, James manages to find some ambrosia. Undergoing his sync test, James is confronted by various memories and past events from his life. These include his baseball career and his injury, his first body replacement, and then the train incident. The test specifically taps into the trauma of the death event and how to move past it. This helps synchronize, and James recalls details. He remembers how he and his partner Seth were chasing a dealer and then his gun jammed. He remembers a powerful explosion that derailed the train. James recalls his desperation to get this guy and to mete out justice. He speaks of his guilt about what happened to Seth. Approaching his previous dead shell, the psychologist says that they should stop, but James wants to continue and moves towards a light where he sees a memory of Rachel's death. It seems that she indeed jumped to her death in 2317 from the balcony of their apartment. Waking up after the test, James is advised to stay at home for 9 to 12 months. This doesn't go down well at all. Contacting Sarah, James tells her that he'll finish the case alone as he doesn't want to drag her down with him, but she refuses to let him do so, as she's just as invested in this crime as he is. So they put together another case board to work out what they'd learned from the crime scene on the Icarus. Using their evidence, they recall that Green and Kovalev's cases are linked by the Ouroboros symbol and date, with both dates representing both Green and Kovalev's deaths to the date. Kovalev also had a similar substance to Green in his system. Green had left a note for Kovalev saying that now is the perfect time to bite, indicating a plan was to be set in motion and that blowing himself up was part of that plan. And also that Agent Dean had bought blueprints to Green's apartment. Curious about what relevance the blueprints have, James heads to Green's apartment again, now sealed off by the feds, and looks around. He notices a safe. Using the keycard he found in the safe on the Icarus, James discovers a secret passageway. Along with enough of the green flammable liquid to do some serious damage, James also finds a deceased man in an elevator dressed in formal attire. It's Brian Coven, the man who, along with Green, made substantial donations to the orphanage. He's been shot. Taking the elevator down, James comes across another grisly murder scene. Reviewing the murder scene, James finds many members of the high society elite there, all of them killed, dressed up as part of a theme party. He hears the voice of the stranger again, taunting him. James strongly suspects that whoever this person is the murderer. He traces the direction of the shots and discovers the echo of a lone gunman. Playing with the power, something activates and reveals a secret viewing chamber that emerges from the underground. Inside, he discovers the shells of Senator Patricia Terrence, who appears to have been shot at close range, and her husband, movie actor Drake Starr, had been shot too, except Drake Starr had switched bodies for some reason. What's more is that they'd used real Icarite to tie him up. James discovers that the gunman walked into this orgy, opened fire, but that Patricia Terrence jumped upon the gunman with a knife and attacked him before she was shot. Realizing that the holograms at the scene were recordings, James needs to find the footage, and finding a mechanism in order to take the secret room back down, James discovers something shocking. Green had his very own bank of consciousness transfer machines and was able to transfer his consciousness to different bodies when and where he pleased. This means that for what happened upstairs, Drake Starr was only using a disposable body for the weird sex games in the secret room. Wasteful, meaning that this is probably the previous body that Drake was using. The other bodies are orphans that have now come of age, but before we continue on, let's learn a little bit about desynchronization. As we've learned, the attacks that James has been experiencing were as a result of something called desynchronization. The more a person swaps bodies, the more unstable their Icarite and by extension their psyche becomes as it attempts to keep on adapting to a new body. Weekly basic level calibration sessions were mandatory for the people who could not afford the premium Synchro Plus program, and this ensured that people wouldn't suffer synchronization issues. Well, that was the idea anyway. These tests help people recall past memories and experiences, I guess to help their psyche feel more at home in its new body. However, studies did show that Icarite transplantation does not guarantee continuity of identity, hence desynchronization. Other studies show that the risk of memory disorders increase after prolonged storage inside the memory banks, along with the theory that people who are stored inside the banks can still dream. Symptoms of desynchronization are thought by researchers to hit hard at around the 100-year mark. and that's pretty much where James is at. Now, how did this apply to Edward Green? Due to Edward Green technically being very old, he had been experiencing the same issues James is, but for a long time. He sought therapy from Jane Salmer. She helped him to work through these issues.
How did you describe it? That you're losing control of yourself? It's a kind of consciousness erosion. We'll increase the dose of ambrosia and the amount of synchro tests. Should help.
I need something better.
We don't have anything else yet. I'm working on it.
It's one big joke.
As we see in Green's underground lair, he has several consciousness transference machines, meaning that he was transferring his consciousness multiple times into different bodies. This likely exacerbated his already bad symptoms. Looking at footage from the cameras, James is shocked to find that the shooter was none other than Edward Green, and the attack took place the same night as Green's death, which explains how he got the knife wound on his back. It was from the governor, and that also explains why he had traces of gunpowder on his hands. Before heading back upstairs, James hears the stranger's voice again, and he mentions Sarah's name. Thinking she's in danger, James needs to leave. James decides to leave the Red Room and has to make another choice, whether to leave the door open, meaning that the Elite's Icarite will be able to be salvaged and replanted into a new shell, or shutting the door to the Red Room, essentially entombing the Elites inside, therefore condemning them to a permanent death. Whatever James chooses, he leaves the apartment. Heading to Liberty Island, James manages to track down Sarah's place. It's a nightmare to get to and inside an old museum, but he ends up in a tense standoff with Sarah before she realises it's James and not some random intruder. To James's surprise, she looks ill and very old for someone who is apparently 29 years of age. He surmises that she's changed her shell, and she tells him that she's renting her younger, better shell out on the black market to someone else in order to raise money. But for what, exactly? Well, years ago, Sarah had a lover, Taylor. Taylor and herself were in the slums of Liberty Island and were looking for a place they could call home, and after digging through rubble, they found the museum. They settled there and sold junk that they'd found. But one day, Taylor tricked Sarah. Sarah had just turned 21 and Taylor paid for Sarah's body subscription without her knowing. Problem was that they didn't have the money for Taylor's subscription, so one day, the Immortality squad came knocking and took Taylor away. Her body then went to auction, whilst Taylor's consciousness was taken to the memory bank. Sarah's mission is to get her out of the bank, which is why she's been renting her real body out on the black market. Scouring Sarah's place for some ambrosia after suffering another attack, James discovers that Sarah has 3 brothers, Max, Peter and Dario. She sent them away and they live in an apartment together. James also finds something damning. Sarah has clearly rented her body out to Jane Salmer, and that Jane Salmer has been walking around in Sarah's body, enjoying the lifestyle of elites. She wore out her old shell, which Sarah is now using, through decades of drug taking and debauchery. Confronting her on this, she says that she's renting the body out as a surrogate, so Jane Salmer can have a child. Anyway, there's more to investigate, so they set up another case board. They remember that Green had an illegal consciousness transfer machine in a secret room. He had also committed the massacre and then self-deleted. Green and Kovalev had enacted and planned out many ways of trying to save the system they currently have in place, as their predictions as to what could happen if it was changed, for example lowering the age of subscription and increased taxation, could cause the whole thing to come tumbling down. They hear recordings of a session between Jane Salmer and Edward Green, in which he described losing control of himself. They recalled that the elites were meeting at Green's secret room in order to work out how to calm the rioting over body subscriptions, and the people who were there, that were journalists and TV presenters, would deliver messages through people's TV screens in an attempt to distract people from what's happening. As mentioned, Green had been experiencing issues from swapping bodies so many times. He was losing parts of himself, of his consciousness. James thinks that someone may have used his psyche being in a weakened state in order to influence him. They remember seeing this and thinking that Green had looked like he was being forced. One thing that seems to be the case is that Green was very intrigued about Rome and how Rome fell, largely due to the distrust of the government, among other things. Green dying before the plan was enacted though doesn't make much sense, so their next step is to decide whether a murderer is responsible for the death of Green, or whether this was all a part of Green's master plan. Either the murderer or Green are attempting to paralyze the city. Sarah searches for other poisoning cases from recent years and one comes up. James's wife, Rachel. It involves the train accident case. She says that James won't be able to go there and reconstruct the scene, but James isn't having it and sets off. Heading to the scene of the train accident, James hears that a memorial in Central Park for Green's death has been marred by riots, and that the area is being locked down. James spots the train and walks towards it. We learn that James went after a suspect alone, despite Seth pleading with him not to. Seth put the suspect's name into the database, but nothing came up, almost like something is being covered up. James was hell-bent on catching this guy, so much so that he shot without restraint, killing many innocents in the process. Reconstructing the scenes is doing massive damage to James as he is tapping into his own memories. He frequently hears the stranger, the murderer, talking to him. James considers that maybe the murderer is hijacking people's synchro tests, and that's how he's being able to influence them. Sarah contacts James and says that her body, meaning Jane Salma, is in trouble. We eventually learn that the man James was after was a dealer who had sold poison to Rachel. She'd taken it, and it was one of the factors in the lead up to her death. Seth turned up during a confrontation and told James that they need to leave as a counter-terrorism team was on the way. The dealer shot Seth's car, resulting in the explosion that derailed the train, causing the train accident, and as we learned at the start of the game, James was then suspended, and then because his old body was dead, James's Icarite was transferred to an E-Class shell, the only one the police department could afford. James's guilt comes from the fact that he refused to wait for Seth, killed a load of innocents, and ultimately got Seth killed. More torment from the murderer, desynchro attacks and visions of Rachel, along with a vision of him drinking the poison, sees James rise to his feet whilst hearing Sarah frantically stating that Jane Salma is in danger. She went to the Green Memorial at Central Park and is trapped by rioters. James hops into his car and heads to the event, and it's teeming with police. James crash lands in the park and overhears an officer being viciously attacked by some of the mob. Crawling from the car, James makes his way through the fake holograms of trees and is confronted by the chief. He tells James that he needs to get in the car, but when he refuses, the chief ends up shooting James, telling him he'll come back for his Icarite later. All of a sudden, a car crashes and a massive explosion takes place. James pulls himself up. Walking forward, he sees Jane Salma, unharmed and pregnant. She shoots at James, thinking him to be a rioter. Bizarrely though, James starts speaking with the murderer, and the murderer starts speaking through Jane Salma. Eventually, James confronts Salma and the murderer and has to make a choice. So there are two endings, well, technically four, but two are just variations of the main two, if that makes sense. These endings depend on the decisions that James made throughout the story. If James did not shoot Boyle on the Icarus, didn't close the door to the Red Room, convinced himself that the murderer was behind everything that had happened, and chooses not to shoot Jane Salma, James bleeds out whilst telling Sarah that her body is safe, but the murderer escaped in it. James's Icarite is then retrieved by, I'm guessing, Chief Steiner, and stored in the memory bank for who knows how long. In the aftermath, Sarah leaves James a message telling him that she got her body back. She tells James that if she sells her body on the black market once or twice more, she'll have enough money to get Taylor out of the memory bank. In the variation of this ending, if James shoots Jane Salma, she actually survives, and the same thing happens, except that Sarah's message is slightly different. On the other hand, if James shot Boyle on the Icarus, closed the door to the Red Room, convinced himself that Green was behind everything that had happened, and chooses to shoot Jane Salma, she shoots him back and they both die, with James ending up in the memory bank. Sarah leaves a voicemail for James and she's obviously distraught, as Jane Salma and Sarah's body is dead. Jane Salma apparently got her Icarite transferred into another body. She also mentions that the chief turned out to be dirty, and that she has a load of information on him that she's going to make public. On the flip side, in a variation of this ending, James can simply choose to throw his weapon away. He then drinks the poison, steps onto an edge and jumps into the abyss, therefore dying. In the afterlife, James meets with Rachel on the beach and the game then ends. In an ending voicemail from Sarah, she mentions that she got her body back, and she then had enough money to get Taylor out. She then says a tearful goodbye, and that's pretty much it. So we have some more stuff to unpack here in an attempt to decipher this pretty confusing story, so let's begin with what Green's plan was. As we've mentioned, Green changed bodies many times, and had the consciousness transfer machine underneath his apartment. Constantly changing bodies harmed Green's psyche, along with around 5 or 6 lifetimes worth of trauma attached. He started to lose himself. The same thing happened to Kovalev. He was experiencing these things too. With the impending changes to the laws around body subscriptions, Green and Kovalev ran predictions on what would happen to humanity, and it was not good. So they needed to act, and to act fast. A date was set for everything to be set in motion. These specific dates were scratched and painted onto both the tree in Green's apartment and the safe behind the bar on board the Icarus. The snake itself, an Ouroboros, is of ancient Greek origin and depicts the snake devouring its own tail. This represents the concept of eternity, and in this case immortality, dying and then being reborn. Anyway, in Green's apartment, James can find a folder on the desk which is signed off by Chief Steiner. It mentions that many people who are due to be convicted for various things, but that would not be able to appeal their conviction in any way. By the looks of it, Steiner was using Agent Dean to buy the blueprints to Green's building. But for what? To try and find out where he was keeping the evidence he had on him, maybe? In terms of his overall goal, I think it's pretty clear now that Green wanted the city's most influential people to be wiped out, therefore keeping things the way they are currently. Humanity was destined to be doomed if the changes to this immortality were brought about. So Green would kill everyone in a secret meeting with many elites in attendance. He'd then take himself out. Kovalev would do the same and put an end to the plans to lower the age of subscription and to impose massive taxes. Green's farewell ceremony was the final piece of the puzzle, and with all the elites in one place for his memorial, he'd bank on the rioters attacking and killing them, with his destabilization plan having been fully carried out. Well, simply put, there wasn't one. James went through the whole case believing there was a murderer, a stranger that kept talking to him and taunting him. This stranger is pretty much just a symptom of desynchronization. Rachel and Edward Green heard the voice too. Green wrote about feeling his breath on his neck, and James says the same thing at the end of the game. It could be that Rachel's voice was a female one. In James's case, his desperation to catch the dealer on the train carried over to his new body and got worse because of more desynchronization. An effect of a worsening psyche. Is it psychosis or schizophrenia? Salma describes it in one of Green's sessions as an erosion of consciousness. James revealed that in a previous conversation with Seth, he'd mentioned having synchro issues. Seeing the doll looking at him was another manifestation of his desynchronization. As for Green seemingly being attacked or attacking himself, we also see this through James's desynchronization attacks as he fights with himself as he's holding a knife. Throughout the game, we see that Rachel would appear to James. A lot of these visions were residual memories. In James's apartment that he shared with Rachel, we can see a blocked off door to what seems to be a child's bedroom. James and Rachel had a child named Brian, but it's never made clear what happened to Brian. Judging from the vision on the train where James gets pulled into a hallucination of Brian's room, the date of the 25th of March 2317 is written on the wall, along with the Ouroboros symbol, meaning that whatever happened to Brian happened 12 years prior to the game's events. Whatever happened to Brian hit Rachel hard, and she couldn't bear the thought of their child being taken from them, so she contacted a dealer, the one that James confronted on the train, and she got a hold of some poison, the same poison that James found. Now, it's important to know that this poison doesn't actually kill people. It's a poison to Icarite and not to a person. All it guarantees is that after a person is dead, their Icarite cannot be salvaged. Final death, basically, and this is what Rachel took before her death. It ensured that she'd pass on for good. Green took this poison, and so did Kovalev. The top brass didn't want James and Seth going after the dealer because there being a poison to destroy Icarite was bad news, as this was the hold that the government had over its people and a way of them making a lot of money. The dealer on the train even indicates that he's working for someone powerful. Was it Green himself? Who knows? But that's pretty much it for the story for this game. A pretty decent noir-style detective game and a great first game for the studio. Not sure at this point whether or not there'll be a sequel. The game was a bit too hand-holdy for me, but nonetheless, I did enjoy it. If you enjoyed this video, then please leave a like, subscribe if you aren't already, and leave your thoughts and theories down below. But for now, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.